Um, if a parent says, my child, don't pick up snakes, that would clearly be wise advice, and children don't have the freedom to experiment with such pieces of wisdom. They better believe their parents when their parents say, don't pick up snakes, or don't pick up spiders. So the rule of thumb that would be built in by natural selection into a child brain, believe whatever your parents tell you, quite clearly could have survival value. Now, once that rule of thumb has been built into the nervous system, once the brain has been hardwired to be, as a child, credulous and believe what your parents tell you, then that is automatically open to any sort of statement that the parent might make, which could be a religious statement. And the child brain, with the rule of thumb, believe what your parents tell you, has no way of knowing whether the advice being given is sensible advice, like don't pick up Eastern groin ropers, or whether it is nonsense, like you have to bow to the great God of the mountains 3 times a day, or whatever it might be. How is the child brain to know? The survival value lies in the psychological predisposition to believe your parents, and the consequence of that psychological predisposition might very well be religion. And there are all sorts of, that's just one example of the kind of psychological predisposition I'm talking about. There could be others. So.
There's a bit of a psychological predisposition amongst evolutionary biologists to want to describe everything in terms of Darwinian utility. But as you point out yourself in your books, there's also a notion of, in a sense, Darwinian dysfunctionality, which is something which tacks on as part of the bigger package, so that something really important is selected for that, but it brings with it something which is deleterious.
I mean, that's an excellent point. Once again, I mean, in a way, it's similar to the point I've just made. We divide the world up in ways that we perceive it, and the questioner asked about religious belief, and I in a way sidestepped it by talking about psychological predispositions. Professor Brown is now pointing out that when you select for one thing, other things may come along for the ride. The most striking example, which I discuss in some detail in The Greatest Show on Earth, is an experiment in Russia where they were breeding for tameness in foxes. They had large populations of captive foxes which were being bred for fur farming. And they were deliberately trying to breed for tameness. They set out to breed from the tamest foxes in every generation. And they, with dramatic success, in a mere few decades, they had produced foxes which were no longer wild and dangerous biting creatures, but had become just like dogs. And what was fascinating was that other things came along for the ride. Having selected for tameness, which was the target of selection, these foxes looked like dogs. They lost their fox-like fur colour and became patchy like a collie. They, instead of having prick ears like a fox, they had floppy ears, like many breeds of dogs. Their breeding season became dog-like rather than fox-like. There were many other examples of dog-like characteristics which were not deliberately selected at all, but which were dragged along for the ride in the wake of selection for tameness. And that is a very common and important phenomenon in evolution. You think that feature X is being selected for. What you don't realize is that features Y, Z, A, B, and C are being selected at the same time, whether you like it or not.
Well, you've been very patient, so please.
That's all right. I was brought up by religious crackpots. And looking back, I feel that if I'd heard someone just come along and say, it's a load of bullshit, I really feel that would have helped enlarge my thinking. because when I went to school, I was abusive to teachers who were talking about geology and biology. Is there any way that we can inform the world, or all 12-year-olds in the world, that religion is a load of bullshit?
The other thing I was told about Australians is they're not only very friendly, but they're very plain-spoken, and I'm all for that. Yes, well, there are two schools of thought. There's a great debate going on in what's called the blogosphere at the moment about the right way for us to proceed. There are those who say that it's called framing. There are those who say we must go out and seduce. We must go out and be nice and say yes, you can be religious and we understand and we feel for you. But had you considered this perhaps, and had you considered that perhaps? And that's one school of thought, and they're called the framers for some reason. And then there's the school of thought that I'm supposed to belong to, which is rather more along the lines of the questioner. I think we probably need both. I think that there is a role for the seductive approach. I never was much of a seducer, but there's also a role for this is just bullshit. Some people respond to one and some people respond to the other. I do think that there is merit in clarity. I don't actually tell people what they believe is bullshit. What I do is, I hope, use clear language to say exactly the way things are. And there are people who are so in love with obscurity, a nice warm fuzzy feeling of obscurity and obscurantism, that if you say something clearly, they feel threatened. There are people who are actually threatened by clarity. And so I do have a reputation among religious apologists for being aggressive and arrogant and strident and shrill and things like that. I don't think I'm any of those things. I'd like to think that I'm clear, and what I believe is that some of those people interpret clarity as a threat.
Okay.
Professor Dawkins, speaking of different schools of thought, what do you think about the concept of different human races?
Human races are very interesting because they are, at least superficially, really rather different. I mean, the differences between the various human races are fairly dramatic, such that if you saw them in wild animals, you'd probably say these are different species. And yet we are fully capable of interbreeding, and we do interbreed, of course, all the time. The biological species concept, the most influential idea of the biological species, is that any population which is fully interbreeding is one species, and therefore the fact that different human races freely interbreed means that we are all one species. If you look at the genetics, we are a remarkably uniform species. It has been said that any two chimpanzees drawn from the same part of the jungle in Africa are genetically likely to be more different from each other than any two humans drawn from anywhere in the world. So that's a very, very surprising fact, and it's not borne out by the superficial appearance of things like skin colour and nose shape and hair formation and so on. So what it looks to me like is as though humans, although we are fundamentally very, very uniform, a very, very uniform species, we differ superficially in external appearance, and that's the question we ought to be asking, is why we look so superficially different, whereas genetically we are so very similar. I don't discuss that in The Greatest Show on Earth. I do discuss it in an earlier book called The Ancestor's Tale, which it would be undignified for me to recommend to you.
We've now got a real challenge ahead of us. We've got 5 minutes left. So, fast questions, fast answers, please.
Mr. Dawkins, what do you think drove Darwin to investigate evolution?
Darwin was above all else, a naturalist. He loved beetles as a young boy, and he all his time at Cambridge, when he was training to be a priest, training to be a parson, he spent most of his time collecting beetles and other things. Then he went round the world on the Beagle, the famous voyage of the Beagle, as captain's companion, but he ended up being pretty much ship's naturalist. It was the constant exposure to the world of nature that originally drove Darwin to think about these things. But then when he got back to England, he became an invalid for reasons that are obscure but interesting, and he stayed at home virtually all the rest of his life, thinking, writing, corresponding with people all around the world, and he was one of the world's great thinkers, as well as one of the world's great naturalists. And I think that this was, the combination of those two was what made him the great genius that he was, and caused him to solve the problem of life.
Probably his first and last journey.
Yes.
Okay, we'll slip this last question in, please.
Humans tend to make themselves very comfortable, right? We sit in our chairs and listen to thinkers speak, like you. And you, for instance, your eyesight isn't great, so you wear glasses. Things like this, do you think we're affecting evolution in a negative way?
Well, I'm 68 years old, and therefore, anybody of my age has to wear glasses. Genetically, I have rather good eyesight. I didn't actually need glasses until I was about 50. And so, but you're quite right that there are many people who do need glasses at a young age, and that probably is a genetic defect. And that's a comparatively trivial one, although in the world of nature, if you were so short-sighted that you couldn't see an approaching saber-toothed tiger, then there's obvious survival value in having good eyesight. By the time you reach my age, you're past reproduction age anyway, and so it doesn't matter. That's a serious point. After all, if you think about it, genes for having bad eyesight when you're 20, those genes end up in the bellies of saber-toothed tigers. Genes for developing bad eyesight when you're 50 have already made it through to the next generation before they end up in the belly of a saber-toothed tiger. So the older a bad gene shows itself, the more chance it has of being passed through the sieve of the generations into the future before it gets clobbered. And that probably is, in a nutshell, the explanation for why the older we get, the more decrepit we get. The older we get, genes that have made it through the generations because they didn't develop their bad qualities until late in life. We are a kind of dustbin of genes that were good when young, but not when old.
Okay, that's great. Eyeballs and bellies, snakes and groins, you've had it all. It's sad, but we've got to keep things moving because we've got to allow people to move from presentation to presentation. So I really just want to thank the audience for their great courtesy and great involvement. That's thank you all. Thank Richard for his very, very articulate and smooth presentation, and his amazing calm personality, the patience with which he writes these books to correct some madnesses. Just